On 4, 5, and 6, we're going to verify a trigonometric identity. So they're actually going to do the work for you. They're just going to have you tell what rule it is. So again, we're going to use those trigonometric identities, our reciprocal identities, the quotient identities, and now they're also going to add in the Pythagorean identities. Pythagorean identities come from the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and someone figured out sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. 1 plus the tangent squared equals the secant squared, and 1 plus the cotangent squared equals the cosecant squared. So they're just going to add that in. In addition to the reciprocal identity, the quotient identity, and the Pythagorean identities, sometimes you just basically use algebra and you put that in for your rule. So if I go back over here, first thing they did is took 1 minus sine squared of x, changed it to cosine squared of x. That is my Pythagorean identity. It's rearranged because if you noticed on the other sheet, it said sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x equals 1. Well, they just moved this over here and said cosine squared of x equals 1 minus the sine squared of x. So the Pythagorean identities don't always look exactly as the same way they're listed because sometimes they rearranged it and solved it for another part of the expression. But that's your Pythagorean identity. I'm just going to abbreviate. I probably spelled it wrong. P-Y-T-H-A. Pythagorean. There. Pythagorean. On the next one, left the cosine squared, change cosecant of x into 1 over the sine of x. That's my reciprocal identity that we did with the first ones. Here, we just divided up the cosine squared into cosine times cosine. So all that basically is that you did algebra. I just divided my cosine squared to cosine times cosine. Next part, I took my cosine of x over the sine of x, changed it to cotangent of x. That's one of my quotient identities. And so again, they're just having you look through the thing, write down what rule you're going to use. Later on, we're going to actually do this ourselves and put the rule, but they're going to solve some first and then just have you put the rules there. So number 5, if we're completing that one, left the cosine of x, change 1 plus tangent squared into secant squared of x. That's one of your Pythagorean identities again. Pythagorean. My thing is not quite writing where I think it's going to. Next thing they did, they took the cosine of x and changed it into 1 over secant of x. That is my reciprocal identity. The cosine of x equals 1 over the secant. Reciprocal. And then the last thing they did here is they just basically canceled the secant with the secant squared, leaving you the secant. So they just did algebra. So my first rule, I did the Pythagorean identity, then I did a reciprocal identity. The last thing I did is just straight algebra. Number 6. 1 minus the cosine squared of x, they changed it into sine squared of x. Again, that's my Pythagorean identity. Next thing they did, we left the sine squared, we changed the secant into 1 over cosine, so we did the reciprocal identity. Next thing they did, they took the sine squared and changed it into sine times sine. That's just plain algebra. Next thing they did here, sine over cosine is equal to tangent. That's my quotient identity. Sine over cosine equal tangent. There's my identity.